if you look at some of the research globally around what happened in the COVID lockdown period, I think the most fascinating research was done by a team at the University of Chicago. And they looked at what happened to people's brains when they were socially cut off. We'd had this assumption for decades that healthy brains need lots of social connections, that we do well when we're connected to others. So loneliness, and we know about the loneliness epidemic, the impact that has on things like cardiovascular health and longevity and all the rest of it, but we'd never really studied what it does for the way we think until en masse, you had whole populations at home, isolated. What they found is that when you're lacking social connections, the amygdala, which is where that fight and flight reflex resides, part of the instinctive mind, shrinks, and this surface becomes coarser, becomes different, it changes. Now, the tricky thing with that is when the amygdala shrinks, those fight and flight reflexes become more acute.
How do you get 10,000 people to take a step to the left? What's behind the relentless mindset of a world champion? Why do teams of exceptional talent fail? How do you manage the pressure to perform? These are just some of the curious questions we will attempt to answer as we bring you world leaders, curious minds, exceptional talent, successful CEOs, and incredible human beings who know how to inspire great leaders and are inspiring great leaders themselves. I am Craig Johns, high performance leadership expert, international speaker, and CEO of Speakers Institute Corporate and World Sport Coach. This is the Inspiring Great Leaders podcast, where the ordinary don't belong. Welcome to the Inspiring Great Leaders podcast. Our guest today is a multi-award winning speaker, change strategist, and the best-selling author of 10 books. His education includes a Bachelor's of Commerce from the University of Wollongong and a wealth of daily research into human behavior and future trends. With clients including Google, Toyota, and MasterCard, he has helped some of the world's most successful brands navigate uncertainty and stay ahead of the curve. In his 20th year as a professional speaker, he was the president of Professional Speakers Australia for just over 8 years, a former Australian Keynote Speaker of the Year, and inductee into the Professional Speakers Hall of Fame. I have the rare privilege of going deep into the mind behind the most recent best-selling author of Mindstuck, as we make sense of why people favor certainty and comfort versus embracing new curiosity and change. Michael McQueen. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. So, University in Wollongong, live in Sydney now. Where did you grow up, and what was the big dream as you ran around the playgrounds?
So, grew up in Wollongong, suburban Wollongong, went to a government high school. Dad was a school teacher, mum a pharmacist. So just a fairly standard suburban middle-class family. I'm one of 5 boys, so you can imagine that was like a lot of energy at all times in my family. I'm second oldest out of the 5. And strangely, my dream from a really young age was to do what I do right now, which I know is particularly unusual because most people, when you're a kid, you want to be an astronaut or a firefighter. So the genesis moment for, I guess, this career for me was when I was 8. So I tagged along with my parents to a conference that they had gone to. The babysitter had fallen through, so my brothers and I all sat at the back with coloring books. And there was a speaker on the stage who was this brilliant communicator from the States named Florence Littauer. And she'd written a book years ago on personality styles. And she just was a superb speaker. She held that room, that auditorium for an hour. And I was just, even as a kid, transfixed with that skill and just interested in how does that work. And even from that point onwards, I was interested in listening to good speakers, understanding what makes someone a good communicator. So obviously a very unusual child. But I remember walking out of that auditorium that day with my parents, having just listened to Florence Littauer and saying to my mum, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And I think she politely, like all parents, when your 8-year-old says what they want to do, you go, oh, that sounds great. Awesome. But it stuck as a thing that was the sort of goal. And so post university, once I'd moved to Sydney, I'd met a few people who were on the circuit, conference circuit, and they gave me a bit of mentoring. And then I sort of got my start 20 years ago. When you say that, it's like, wow, that's a long time. I feel old all of a sudden. But yeah, like that was the genesis moment and how I sort of got into this.
And what was it about the way that Florence, articulated and communicated on stage? Was it more what they were saying, or was it a lot more around the way it was delivered and connecting with the people in the audience?
I think it was more the latter. I mean, I was so young. The content itself, I guess, would have been of some interest, that idea of understanding how different people think and personality and temperament modeling. But as an 8-year-old, I think I was just more fascinated by the show, by not just the hype. She wasn't a hype type speaker, but she just was able to captivate an audience. And I found that just fascinating as a kid. Like, how do you do that? And I guess maybe as the youngest, even from the youngest age, just was, I guess, in my blood, this idea of wanting to do this. Because I remember in preschool, so I must have been like 3 or 4, and I have this vivid memory of where this toy box of all these toys, and in the toy box was a microphone. And I remember literally picking this microphone up out of the thing, looking in through a little grate to see how that thing worked, and the little grill on top, the little metal grill, and consciously having the thought, gee, I wonder if I'll ever get to use one of these one day when I grow up. How fun would that be? But like that was, so these moments right throughout childhood that I guess in some ways I was always just intrigued with this world, not the glitz and the glamour of it, but just what it takes to be able to communicate in a compelling way. I've just always been attracted to that, fascinated by that, curious about that. So in a way, that was the on-ramp to this whole crazy fun world of conference speaking.
And so having that at age 8, did that really, I suppose, not control, but could it help you navigate through high school years and think about what subjects you did and maybe what extracurricular activities you were involved in? Like, was drama there, was singing, acting?
Yeah, good question. So I think sort of, probably it was more just there was a bit of a confluence of things that were all related to each other that I just became interested in. So like I was happy to do the SRC thing. And like if there had to be a school announcement about a fundraiser or whatever, I was happy to get up and do it. It just didn't bother me. I found it just an interesting challenge to get up and try and communicate something that would otherwise be pretty boring. Like, make sure you bring your $2 coin for Mufti Day on Friday. But how do you make that fun and interesting? And so I never shied away from that. I remember being in debating teams. I remember going into public speaking competitions and not doing well at all. And it's funny, I was chatting with a mate the other week who he and I was from another school, but we often sort of would bump into each other at these zone or regional public speaking things. And he was the same. He's a great communicator, a corporate leader now, incredibly well regarded. But he and I would both just bomb in these public speaking competitions because what it wasn't actually public speaking. It was like speech and drama. So it was all about theatrics and the poetry and the sound of your voice and lifting, then lowering, then whispering. I'm like, to me, massively inauthentic. And so like, that's never been my vibe. I'm not a hugely melodramatic speaker. When I'm on stage, whether it's like 200 people or like biggest audience, 25,000, like if you give me a massive audience, I'm still just having a conversation. My energy is elevated a little bit, but like truly, it's just about connecting with another group of humans or another human. To me, it's very much that the whole notion of communicating rather than presenting to. So yes, I remember doing those competitions and like never going well. And sometimes I think I'd love to find the people who are the adjudicators and just like, I don't know, reconnect with them now. Because basically the feedback was, you're not very good at this. I'm like, okay, cool. But like now this is what I do and I love it. So it is interesting how throughout school that was a consistent theme.
Yeah, I think, I failed English at school, but I became, I kind of lead or own a global communications company. I always find that kind of fascinating as well.
Yep.
Now, you've been in it for 20 years. So what type of training did you do to get yourself prepared as, I think probably a young 20-year-old or in your 20s?
Yeah.
And you're getting prepared to speak in front of stages with people who have a lot of more experience, probably a lot more expertise, a lot, maybe even greater understanding of the topics you're speaking about. How did you get yourself ready and primed to be able to stand in front of people and deliver something, get paid for it, and feel comfortable in your skin?
Yeah. So where I started was initially realizing that being young, like I was 22 when I started this whole caper, like being young, you've got to be realistic. So I was not an extraordinary person. I had not climbed a mountain or broken a world record or any of those things. So my extraordinary thing, like, had to be something that was realistic and authentic. I couldn't put myself out as an expert in, I don't know, communication or team building or whatever. Like, and you see people who try and do that. I'm like, well, what are your chops? What's your experience that gives you any ability to say, I can speak into this with authority? So I didn't really have any of that. And I was mindful of that. So I remember getting some mentoring from a few people who were on the speaker circuit, people like David Penglaze, Lisa McGuinness Smith. And they sort of said, well, you've got to find something where you can be an expert, and maybe the expertise is just that you've got a perspective no one else has got, or you've read more widely and deeply, given this more thought than the average person, and you can become essentially almost like the reporter, the journalist, taking a whole lot of ideas and condensing them into a palatable, useful message. So at the time I was 22, so I thought, well, maybe being young is an asset rather than a liability. I mean, stepping in front of a whole lot of corporates when you're 22 is tricky, again, unless you've got all those other cred things, which I didn't. So I thought, well, probably the young thing is actually an asset if I'm trying to understand youth culture and speak into youth culture. Because at the time there was this, the big flashpoint of conflict, and it was in most of the business press, at least weekly, if not every couple of days, was the whole conflict between baby boomers and Gen X and Gen Y. We didn't even call them millennials at the time. That came later as a term. And Gen Y and millennials are the same group. That's just what Americans call Gen Y. So we essentially have adopted that more globally in the last few years. But at the time it was Gen Y. Gen Z was still in primary school or preschool, so not relevant for the workplace at that stage. So as a Gen Y, there was all this stuff being said about my generation and how we were, and then you fill in the blanks: lazy, entitled, disrespectful, all the rest. And I'm like, there's probably some truth to that. Like, every generation's different. And also those criticisms have been leveled at every generation of young people for about 2,000 years. So that's not new. But what is new? What is different about generations coming through that are younger that is important if you're trying to reach that group and be relevant to them? And I thought, as a young person, that's interesting, because not a lot of young people working in that space. Mostly it's older generations studying generational change from their standpoint. Yeah. To me, the gap was that there weren't a lot of people talking to young people about how older generations thought. And it was that whole notion, this has got to be a two-way street. And so in a sense, it was almost like what I'd first encountered when I heard Florence Littauer speak, of looking at different temperament styles and understanding if we can see how different we are, that's not a case of giving us justification for not getting on. It's a case of how do we understand each other so we can come and meet in the middle, because that's where everything good happens. And so I thought, okay, there's not a lot of research being done with young people, helping them understand young people. That the older generations, that's where I'll start. So I kicked off a program with young people in high school, so you're 10, 11, and 12, basically helping them understand how older generations were thinking. You know, if you're going to get a job in the next few years, here's how the game gets played. This is what they're expecting. You know, your boss will be expecting this. If you want to play the game and flourish and get ahead, this is what's required. So the generation gap in reverse. And then while I was running those programs in schools, and I had a team of speakers running these programs around not just Australia, but beyond over the years, we would then do research about what the attitudes and expectations on the ground of young people were. And so after 3.5 years, I had 80,000 young people as my sample size. We'd worked with a whole bunch of people, whole bunch of 10, 11, and 12 kids all around the world. So then I wrote my first book about youth culture based on that research. And that's what the transition then into corporate land was. So I didn't even try to get on platforms in front of the grown-ups and the corporate mob until I had that credibility. Because I'm like, I can read all the books, but until I've done stuff at the coalface and I've got a perspective that's unique and mine, I really don't think I can stand on that stage with credibility. So that was my entryway into this whole world. And then over the last 20 years, I've written 10 different books, which have all been somewhat related thematically around that. And then my topic and positioning as a thought leader or expert has changed and evolved with that.
I love that, that ability to go, okay, look, I'm young, I don't have the credibility, but I'm going to be able to create my own credibility.
Yeah.
I know, talking to my business partner, Sam Cawthorne, who you're good friends with and know very, very well in the speaking circuit. We talk about a lot that if you can master speaking in front of high school students.
Oh, yeah. Yep. 100%.
You can master speaking in front of anyone, because they're so raw. They will tell you to your face whether you're good or not. Yep. They're not like adults who tend to be a little bit more polite in the way that they can hide their feelings and make you just try and help you feel good through the process if they don't like you.
Oh, yeah.
It is a great way to approach. And 80,000, that's a huge sample size and a great way to collect something and look at it from a different perspective. Because I think sometimes we're either looking at it from one person's point of view. It's either the younger people's point of view or the older people's point of view. and very rarely do we meet in the middle. So I love that approach. I think is fascinating. Where do there's been a lot of talk around generations. Where do you think this is going in the future? Do you think we're still going to be talking about, generations as they currently stand, or is there going to be a different approach to it, do you feel, going forward?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We, of course, went from Gen Y or the millennials then to Gen Z or Gen Z, depending on where you're dialing in from. And then we ran out of letters. Like, it showed a remarkable lack of foresight to start with Generation X. We only had 3 letters before we ran out of the alphabet. So we've now gone back to Generation Alpha. And so Mark McQueen and his team, and I love watching this, you've got an Aussie group of researchers who've set that as the brand, Generation Alpha. Globally, that is now what everyone's calling them. And that started here in Australia. I love that. So Mark and his team coined that idea of Generation Alpha. And I guess we'll go to beta next and we'll go on from there. I don't think generational change is going to go anywhere in terms of trying to understand groups or clusters of humans. I think it's useful. It's always a blunt instrument. I mean, trying to use one term or one label that encompasses the attitudes and expectations of anyone born in a 10, 15, 20-year period is always going to be an inexact science. There's no doubt about that. But like any profiling tool, there's value in understanding broad patterns. I mean, there's similarly limitations in looking at temperament style or gender profiling or national or racial ethnic profiling. I mean, you can't ever say someone is going to be like this because of where they grew up or because of their gender. But at the same time, there are patterns. There are cliches that are cliches because they're a thing. Like, there's actually patterns. So understanding broad patterns is always going to be useful, but we can never take it too far and it become this prescriptive thing of, okay, you're such and such because you're part of this cohort, therefore you will be. And so I think there's a limit to how valuable it is, but I do think the premise still stands that we as human beings, we're often more a function of our times than our parenting. Then the group with the family we're raised in, the culture we're raised in, the era we're raised in has a huge impact on the way we think, the way we process notions of community, tribal instincts, certainly the technology we gravitate towards. And I don't think that's going anywhere. Probably what we will see change in the next few years is the scope of generations shorten and become more narrow. Just because the pace of change means, like, if you've got someone, and you think about this, like I was thinking about a mate the other day, he's also a Gen Y or a millennial. I'm near the top of the Gen Y category or cohort. He's near the bottom. Often we'll talk and I'll say, hey, remember that ad on TV? And he's like, no, don't know it. Or doesn't know that song or that band. Like, we're in the same generation, but so much happened in that time span. We've, of course, seen that significantly speed up over the last 20 or 30, even 40 years. And so I think the idea of talking about a generation of anyone in a 15-year time period becomes a little bit redundant when you think how much changes in 15 years. So we'll probably just see the scope get narrower in the coming few years.
Yeah, it just makes me think to a conversation we just had recently. We've got an au pair from Germany in her early 20s. And a song came on the radio and she goes, who's that? And it was Mariah Carey. And she goes, never heard of her.
Wow.
So like a global superstar.
Yeah.
And so that showcases so quickly that even though she's still relevant on her airways, especially around Christmas time and for many people, but you got someone who lives, in Germany where they do have a lot of exposure to the Western world and to English songs and English, a lot of English things that just because doesn't mean they're always going to see the same world that we do.
Correct. Mind you, I bet she's heard of Taylor Swift. And I bet every single Generation Z and Gen Alpha has. And so you do see, certainly for the generation, for their pop icons and even the technologies they use, there's a far more universal usage and connection with culture and youth culture than we saw even 30 years ago. Whereas every country would have its own superstars, music stars, film stars, bands. Now there's a lot more of that universality, and every generation sort of is clued in because of social media generally to the same sort of stuff.
Yeah, thinking about Taylor Swift, she had, I think, was it 3 concerts in Melbourne, was sold out at like 96,000 people.
Extraordinary, yeah.
And I was reading, and I don't know why I did this because I normally wouldn't probably read into this type of thing, but it was talking about Taylor Swift and, a critic was actually looking at her performance and talking about she sung 44 songs in something like 3.5 hours or something like that. And he said every single song, there wasn't a single point where she lost energy, where there was a lack of choreography. Everything was on point and high performing.
Wow.
And so, and you see that in high performers, like detail is everything. And so I want to come back to you. You've been going for 20 years. You're regarded as, one of the top professional speakers in Australia, if not kind of in this, in the world as well, with your ability and what you can do on that stage that empowers and inspires people. But for you, what is your routine, or I don't know if you have a routine, but what are the key things that you would do on a daily basis that allow you to be able to stand up on stage week in, week out, day in, day out, year in, year out, and be able to continue to not just perform at your best, but continue to find what is that new best for you?
Yeah, great question. And there's probably a lot of things that feed into that, and a lot of it I do very instinctively, intuitively now. It's not even like a planned, I should do this as part of my routine. I'm not probably that as deliberate as that now because it's been so many years, but there will be certainly some things that are intentional. So fitness wise, I try and stay fit. I think you just need to. If you're going to, my schedule is, my wife would say it's ludicrous. Like I'm happy to go on 6 hours sleep, changing time zones constantly, but I do love what I do. So I don't find that massively draining, but you do need to be fit. I'm taking vitamins, supplements. I'm big on that, have for probably 15 years. And I do think they really help because just the toll otherwise physically would be significant. If you think about what our bodies are producing when you're on stage performing, like the adrenaline and what happens after adrenaline gets processed, the cortisol that's involved, how that just plays out in your system, you've got to be very mindful of the physical toll that performance takes. So I think being fit, healthy is valuable. And the other thing I do, and I've got all my mates laugh at this. So I stay in all these fancy hotels night after night. Well, not every night, but like probably a third of any week I'm in a hotel somewhere. They're normally pretty fancy. And it's always like breakfast is included, amazing breakfast buffet. I never, or pretty much never eat at breakfast buffets. It'd be a very rare occasion because I pack a little Tupperware container with Weet-Bix and a little popper-sized UHT milk, and I just eat cereal every week, every day in my hotel room because I'm like, I cannot afford to be eating like the bacon and the eggs and the hash brown, all the awesome things, but you just can't do that every day. So I'm very disciplined with things like that mean physically I can front up and be on and know what I need to perform well. And the other thing I find that's very helpful to stay sort of in the pocket is to never get too distanced from the audience. My least favorite events is where, you turn up at the conference thing and they usher you through a back door into a green room and there's like minders and fruit baskets and all the hullabaloo. And then you like get poked out the side of a stage in front of the lights and it's like, go for it. I'm like, I find that very difficult to connect with an audience. You do it and it's fine. Like there are sometimes I'll do these big events where, I'll be staying at the hotel in the city wherever this big arena conference is. They'll pick you up in a town car, one of those big, particularly in America, the big suburban black cars, tinted windows. You get dropped at the back of the convention center in little golf carts. It's the weirdest world. Golf carts through all the back alleyways and then into the green room. I'm like, to me, I don't love that because if I don't feel like it's the connection with an audience is like a dance. You need to be able to sense where they're at and then dance with them. Like it's energy give, energy take. And so I do find that one of the helpful things is to at least have a number of connections points where I get to hear the stories of the audience members afterwards. And I get to chat and just get a sense of who they are. Sometimes it's useful afterwards because they then know what your content is and they then share how their experience or story connects with what you've shared. I find that very useful, but that really helps, I think, to stay focused on your why. Over time, it's very easy for it to become you're delivering a script if you're not careful. It's like a monologue on stage in the form of a keynote day after day. And like there's a notion of an audience is out there somewhere, but if you're not connecting with them, you lose that sense of why. Why are you doing this? Why does it matter? So as well as the physical health things, I also find that very, very helpful. And I must say too, talking to audiences, listening to the questions they're asking, that's where I get my best ideas. Most of the books I've written will have come from a conversation with an audience member where they've asked a question, I'm going, gee, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Never thought about it. Or I'll keep the consistent question keeps coming up. I'm like, there's a thing here that'd be good to unpack because it might be useful for a group, an audience, a market. And so if you're not listening and in proximity with your audience, you're missing a whole lot of data that's very helpful as well.
Yeah, it's good. When I look at corporate, they're in performing mode most of the time and very rarely do they sit in that preparation, planning, training type of mode. It's maybe like 97% they're trying to perform and 3% they're kind of getting ready to perform. Whereas I come from the world of being an athlete where it's the opposite way. You might perform 3% of the time and 97% of the time whether it's training, whether it's mental, whether it's recovery, whether it's eating, sleeping, etc. All that is part of your getting ready to make sure that you can perform at your best. But I find corporate very different. For you speaking, and we're talking just off air just before we came on around that, this time of year you might be doing 2 or 3 keynotes a week, but when you get to the kind of peak season through the middle of the year, you might be doing 5 or 6, and it's that's fairly intense. People might go, "Oh, you're only on stage for an hour," but there's a lot more to it.
Yeah.
So how do you make sure mentally, yes, you talked about being with the audience, but how do you make sure mentally you're sharp every day? And that, as you say, when you're doing it lots of times, it can easily fall into that space of just rinse and repeat. How do you ensure that when you turn up in front of your audience that you're on your A game every single time?
Yeah. So what I find is, particularly when I'm speaking about trends, and still probably because this new Mindstuck topic around the psychology of stubbornness, how do you persuade people who are very rigid or fixed in their way of doing things, that's a relatively new topic. So probably only 20% of my keynotes now are the new topic. 80% is still related to where the world's heading from a trend perspective. AI, robotics, demographic change, innovation, how do you get ready for the future, all that sort of stuff. So that content naturally changes every single day. So that's sort of good, because I find that just interesting anyway, because I'm reading probably upwards of 5 to 7 tech and trend journals or newsletters or online resources every day. So I'm pumping out content every day about what's new, what's happening. That then feeds into my presentation. So I've got this natural cadence of always the new, the new, the new. So that way, it's not the same content. So I find that really helpful. There are some elements of my presentation, particularly the strategy stuff, that's more principle-based. So it's sort of timeless. That tends not to change. Those chunks of a keynote will be pretty similar. So then it's a case of making sure I'm always staying fresh in the delivery. And my wife is an actor on stage and a producer and director of theatre. So she's helped me over the years in terms of the skills that actors use. So, if you're doing a run, let's say, of a theatre show for 3 months, night after night, how do you keep that fresh? Because the audience has only ever seen it once, and you've got to connect what you're delivering from the script perspective to what they're experiencing every day. Because you can pick it. The moment you're hearing a communicator, be it a speaker or maybe an actor on stage, and they're saying all the things, and they may even the emotions go along with it, and the tears and the highs and the lows. They're doing all the things the script demands, but sometimes it's something that just doesn't click. It's like that doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't connect. And the reason typically is because the person's doing all the things, going through the motions, the highs, the lows, the tears, the laughter, delivering the lines, but mentally they're like, what are we going to have for dinner tonight? Or what time do the kids have to get picked up from school tomorrow? Mentally they're not there. So the skill for actors, and I think it's the same for communicators, is make sure you're always connecting the thought with the words, or the feeling with the words. And so if you're just delivering the words without the thinking that behind it, the feelings that go behind that, if it's just the script, people pick up on it. So I find that the moment I start to get to a point where I feel like maybe some content's getting a bit stale, have I connected with the thought, the emotion that underpins that, why that matters and why I'm passionate about that, or think it's an important point. Because if I lose that connection, the audience picks up on it. So with this newer content, because it's a little bit less changeable, it's more principle-based. It's about neuroscience and the psychology of how we make decisions and how we get ourselves backed into mental corners and mental ruts that don't serve us well and cause us to be obstinate when we need to be open-minded and all that sort of stuff. So this content doesn't change as much, because it's not like, OpenAI released a new thing on the week and I've got to now feed that into my presentation. It doesn't really, this is a more static topic. So that is a different challenge then, to keep that really fresh and really real than, say, the trend stuff. But I do find the preparation is critical. So I had an event on Saturday, for instance, and it was all the new content, this Mindstuck, psychology of stubbornness stuff. And this is probably still only, for some of the content was the first time I've delivered this. I wrote some really new stuff, some new ideas, some new content, some new slides, some new jokes. There was a lot, probably 30 or 40% I'd never delivered before Saturday. So in the days leading up to it, I would have done, so that was an hour, 15 keynote. I would have probably spent 12, 13 hours preparing for that. And the morning of, I woke up early in Gold Coast in the hotel room, and I delivered the whole keynote to the wall. And to me, there's just no substitute for out loud delivering content and delivering what some comedians would call bits, a joke or a transition, like those. And then it gets on stage and it seems like it's effortless and it was just something that occurred to you, and it didn't. You've rehearsed that, but it needs to live and breathe. It needs to be organic, can't be so rehearsed that it just feels monotonous and lifeless. But at the same time, there's so much thought and preparation that goes into those moments.
Very good, very good. I think this is good. This is a really good time to kind of pivot towards Mindstuck and really start to understand this new book, the thinking about it. And one thing I loved is that you start the book with, we're told you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
No.
But what if that is not true? And
Yeah.
I think that I love that. I love that because we get so fixated on we've heard something maybe once, maybe multiple times, and we see that as the only truth or the only lens or perspective to look through.
Yep.
Mindstuck, what was the catalyst to this book being, and the whole concept coming together?
So, I mean, like we were saying before, it was a conversation at a conference. I mean, that's where so many of my ideas come from. So this was a conversation, I think it was late 2015, it would have happened, back of the ballroom there at the Hilton Hotel in Sydney on George Street. And it was like an industry association conference that I was speaking at. And I was the keynote before the lunch break. And it was all about the trends, the disruptions coming for that industry, particularly around AI. And then, what that was going to mean for them and their business models. And our keynote went well. It's all great. And I'm standing at the back, just milling around, chatting with people, having sort of demiked and all the rest of it. And a woman came up to me during this lunch break, and I could still picture her. She was like the picture of exasperation. You could just tell she was frustrated. And so we got chatting, and I asked where she worked and what her role was. And then she said, you know what? Very quickly, she wanted to get straight down to business. She said, you know what? I am so with you on this. I like everything you've just said around what's coming for our industry. I'm like, I can see it. And I know that if my organization doesn't change and change fast, we've got like maybe 5 or 6 years before we're out of business. And she said, my biggest challenge is how do I get my leadership team, my exec team on board? Like they just don't see it. It's like for them, they have this really fixed idea about how our business should run, how the industry operates, but it's really dated. It's like that was true 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so I said, well, what have you tried to sort of persuade or bring them around? And she told me all the things she'd done. And it was all the things we're told you should do, all the normal advice. And it hadn't worked. And not only had it not worked, she said it had sort of backfired. And they become more stubborn, more resistant, less willing to listen. And so I'm like, that's interesting that I kept seeing this theme come up time and time again during Q&A times at conferences. And I guess I just got curious. I'm like, well, all the advice we seem to be given isn't working. So what does? Like, can you actually change someone's mind when they're stubborn or resistant? And the good news is there's been a lot of great research, even in the last 5 to 10 years, looking at that very question, particularly because we've gone through such a fractious time in society with COVID, political polarization, conspiracy belief. There's been a lot of attention turned to this notion of how do you get through to people who are stubborn? And the encouraging thing is there's a lot you can do, which is great, but also it's so different to what we've been told. And I think one of the fundamental ideas behind this book is this notion that for the last 400 years, we've basically been conditioned to believe that humans are reasonable and rational. And this is an idea that we can trace right back to Francis Bacon, one of the founding fathers of the Enlightenment. And his big idea was that essentially humans are rational. And so if someone can't see the light, if you want to change their thinking, the key is you've got to expose them to enough reliable, solid evidence. And eventually they'll have no choice but to see the light, to change their mind, to see reason. And so going along with that is an assumption that when someone doesn't see your point of view, the idea is it's an education gap. And if you can just plug the education gap with better information or better evidence, more up-to-date information, then they'll come along and they'll say, well, you were right and I was wrong. And that's just not what happens. In fact, the opposite occurs. The more evidence you give to someone who's stuck or stubborn or fixed on a way of thinking or doing things, the more they dig their heels in, that defensive defiance resistance point kicks off. So a lot of what the book looks at is what actually is effective in getting through to people, and also what's happening in our brains that's causing us to get stubborn. Because I've always been curious with this notion of why don't people change even when they want to, even when they know they should, and they know that there's benefits in them to changing? Why don't they, or we as humans, we're all a bit prone to this. And so that's what a lot of the book unpacks.
Okay, so we've spoken there a lot around trying to give more evidence and the data behind it, and that doesn't really work. It'll work for some people who their brains can comprehend that and go, yep, cool, I've got that. But what are there other things that we've kind of tried to do that we've been taught to do in the past that you find may not always be that effective?
Yeah. So, well, firstly, there'll always be people for whom the facts and the evidence matters, but only if, and this is the key if they've already decided and it's their own choice or agency that's allowed them to get to a point where they've changed their thinking, then they'll be open to logic and evidence to reinforce the assumption they've already arrived at. And so I think one of the key principles is, as humans, we'd rather feel right than be right. And so how do you help people feel like they are right, they're correct, they've arrived at a reasonable conclusion, even though they didn't actually probably get there via reason. And then once they've arrived at that point, then you give them the logic and the evidence to reinforce the belief they've arrived at. So that's one of the really important things. Even the most logical clinical people, we're talking scientists, lawyers, the evidence around how many of them are just as intellectually stubborn and biased as the rest of us is extraordinary. And you would think that they'd be the best of all of us at being scientific and methodical and reasonable. But there's this adage in the scientific community that science progresses one funeral at a time, because even scientists become so rigid in their way of thinking about the world.
Yep.
And this has happened over the centuries. Sometimes, unless you can get through to them or give them the skills needed for them to change their mind without sort of, impinging on their agency, they'll dig their heels in, even when you think scientifically they should be better at this. So that's certainly one of the things that we have to, I guess, unpick, this assumption that evidence and logic alone will work. They play a role, but they're not the key tools. The other thing that I think we've been taught for years, and I've written about this in books, I've said it from stage, and I think we so often believe this, is this idea that humans are afraid of change. And that's just, it's almost a truism, this thing that we just assume is the case. Everyone's afraid of change. That's how humans are. What we've discovered in the last few years is that's not true. We're not afraid of change. What we're afraid of, the thing that causes us to be stubborn, is not change, it's loss. The moment there's a sense of loss, like in the process of changing, I might lose, and the three big ones that lead to stubbornness, I might lose control, I might lose power, or I might lose certainty. The moment we're worried about losing those three things, that's when we dig our heels in, even if deep down we know the change is a good one and we benefit from it. If we feel like there's going to be loss of dignity or certainty or power in the process, that's when stubbornness rears its head. So I think even just rethinking some of those things we've just assumed to be the case for years that actually aren't true. It's the loss, rather than trying to upsell the benefits of change. How do we lessen the loss? Because that's the key challenge. And there's a lot in the book around how do you do that effectively, because there's a real art to doing that.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that I think the research, and don't quote me exactly on this, but the research is something around like 90% of people have a negative thought bias.
There you go. Yeah, I've not come across that. I know optimism bias is often talked about in the literature, but I think it's probably an adjacent theme to that. But yeah, there is this sense of protectionism. I imagine that's what's at the core of that data point. I don't know that data point, but I imagine at the core of it is this notion of we want to feel safe. The moment our minds or our brains don't feel safe, that's when we lock down. And so I think probably what's underpinning that data point, or wherever the research is from, is this idea that for human brains, if you actually look at the way we think, where we do most of our thinking, most of our perception formation is in a part of the brain that I call the instinctive mind. And so there's two minds that we operate in at any given moment. The first is the inquiring mind. That's the frontal lobe, logical, reasonable, rational part. That's what Francis Bacon was speaking about. And we can be those things. But that part of our brain, the frontal lobe inquiring mind, takes a lot of effort and energy, self-control to use. So we just don't use it anywhere near as much as we'd like to think. Anyone familiar with Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, would understand that's the same sort of premise. And he dips into some of the same formative research that I did when forming these ideas of the two minds. So you've got the inquiring mind, then the instinctive mind is a part of the brain typically referred to as the limbic system. So that's the part of our brain where we process emotion. It's the part of our brain that's really good at pattern recognition, narrative formation. If there's gaps out, this part of our brain will make stuff up so that we can help make sense of the world around us. But the big thing that our instinctive mind does is it's where our protection mechanisms live. That's where safety is essential. And so fight and flight reflexes, for instance, when a threat emerges, our instinctive mind jumps to conclusions. Tiger jumps out, so we jump into fight or flight. And that's kept us alive for millennia as a species. The tricky thing is this: our instinctive minds respond to psychological threats the same way they do physical ones. So when you're exposed to ideas or information, and that's again probably where the negative bias kicks in, when you're exposed to things that feel threatening, they challenge your assumptions of who you are, the way the world is, the way you should do things. Our instinctive minds see those as threats because they're unfamiliar or they're uncomfortable. And so we don't go into fight and flight mode. We do two other things. Our instinctive mind goes into denial or defensive mode. And that's where stubbornness tends to live. So part of the key challenge in trying to get people to be willing to change their mind is appealing firstly to the instinctive mind, not the inquiring mind. And again, there's a skill to doing that, but making sure you're making that instinctive mind feel safe enough to consider, safe enough to change. And yet, sadly, what we often do when we're trying to persuade others is we're basically backing them into a corner. And the only option they've got is to, in order to change their mind, is to admit they're an idiot. And of course, the moment humans feel like that's their only choice, no wonder the negative bias kicks off, and they'll kick back, they'll resist at any point because they want to save face and they want to feel safe. So these are the dynamics that we've got to take into account when we're trying to persuade or influence, whether it's in a sales role, a manager with a leader, or a trainer, a communicator with an audience. I mean, when you're communicating with an audience, you are trying to change minds. You're trying to persuade them to see things from a different perspective. So how do you do that in a way that doesn't kick off that defensiveness?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to come back to that 90%. So on the flip side, some of the research I've seen too is that 90% of what people say is positive bias.
Interesting. There you go.
We'll deep think negative, but then we'll put on this, we'll come out more of in a positive speaking mode, which I find quite interesting. And the reason I kind of just bring that last bit up is from what I can recall, I've always had a very much a positive thought bias until I became a parent. And then, and I've done, elite level endurance, sports, many years. You train for Ironman, doing weeks of 40 hours of training in 40-degree temperatures and things like that, where, that's exhausting. But I never found this anywhere near the same as sleep deprivation, where when you've got a new baby and you're kind of always alert, so you're never really allowing yourself to rest in those early phases. And, they might wake up every couple of hours. So just as you're getting into that deep sleep, bang, you're awake again. So you struggle to get really, really good sleep.
Yes.
And so for the first time in my life, like I know I've pushed myself beyond the limits where I've flatlined before, and not just once, but a couple of times. And not from burnout, even though one of them was when I was working 70 to 80 hours a week and I hadn't had a day off in 302 days, I think they worked out.
Oh, wow.
Because I loved everything I was doing. Loved it. Loved it. Setting up an amazing place, world first in Thailand. But my body gave up, right? So my body gave up because I'd pushed beyond its limits. Now that's very, very different to burnout. And some people go, burnout. I'm like, no, this is not burnout, because my mind is still fresh. I'm still thinking well. I might be tired, but I'm still in a really good state of mind. So that's not burnout. That's just, I have just pushed my body beyond what it was capable of at that time.
Yes.
But layering on, working from home, spending time where I was the primary caregiver when my wife went back into work and we were waiting for an au pair and things like that. I got to a point of exhaustion in November where I think I was running on about 5%. And what was interesting, and I've never had this before, and now I understand it, because I couldn't quite understand people when they get into depression, or people when they get to burnout and start to go, their neurochemistry starts to change. And so what I found is that I just become very negative. I was becoming very cynical. Yep. I would look at all the obstacles. I wouldn't see any of the opportunities, and I could see it and feel it, but I couldn't do anything about it. It was kind of one of those things where you go, you know what? Tomorrow it's going to be okay. I'll get a good night's sleep tonight. I'll feel great tomorrow.
Yeah.
And until a couple of, very people close to me finally said something, and I was in it for a while. I'm like, why don't you just tell me? and I just literally had to go away for 5 days and get sleep, and 9-10 hours a night. And then it started to help. And I've got back to a point now where I'm more positive thinking all the time. And I was just finding that fascinating. And when I think about, you're talking about persuasion and influence and stubbornness, when we look at a lot of people in this day and age where, that we've gone through a phase where, less sleep is a kind of a middle type thing for some people. But then we're not letting our minds relax because people are social media, so their brain is kind of frying all the time, or they're watching Netflix series all night and they're not getting that sleep. What what sort of things can we do to try and shift people's minds to get themselves healthy first, so they can really start changing the way that their brain can think? And so I'm wondering if you've seen any research around this, or whether you've got anything in this and what you're doing.
Yes. So it's interesting. So the COVID years were fascinating because they revealed a lot to ourselves about ourselves. As a society, I mean, as Aussies, we learned a lot about ourselves because we have this narrative we tell ourselves that we are, renegades, we break the rules, we push back against authority. My goodness, we were so compliant as a country. Not all of us, but by and large, our cultural response was so different, let's say, to what happened in the States. And yet we would like to think that we're fiercely independent. We're the convict descendants as a culture. And so we push back against authority. But when the authority said do this, we were remarkably compliant. So I think we learned a lot about our culture, but also individually the psychology of how we react to those things. And I don't know what your experience of COVID was like, but it's funny you talk about you're all good with hard stuff, pushing yourself, all the rest of it. But when it's something you have very little control over, which in this case is parenting, it's a different type of hard. And that's interesting because very often the mechanisms you would have don't work in that context. That's what my experience in COVID was exactly that. I'm all up for hard. I love resilience. I love pushing myself. I'm very goal driven. I'm very sort of that A-type personality. That's just my wiring. I don't mind hard, but I realize I don't do well with unfair. When things are unfair and like stuff happens to you that is deeply and grossly unfair. I mean, in our industry, of course, the whole thing stopped overnight. Essentially, having a conference was deemed illegal. And so for those who make their entire living, and so we're in a family where my wife is an actor, runs a theatre company, shut down. My work shut down. We had just finished a home renovation that went way over budget and pretty much almost bankrupted us. Like, it was so close. And we're actually very diligent people financially. So this was completely out of our control, completely unfair. We were like massively done over. And so, but we were like, okay, it's okay. We'll just rebuild financially. Then COVID hit. So we're like on the skids already. And then we'd lost all of our revenue for the next 3, 6, 12 months. And we had no idea how long. So I noticed in that moment, my psychology, my reaction was not what I would like to have had. Like, honestly, and a bit like you're describing there, you've done hard stuff. And then all of a sudden you're in this situation. You think this is comparatively not as hard, but I don't know what to do, and I'm just burning out. I was the same in the whole COVID year. So I think we all learned a lot about how we react and respond when things get difficult and what it brings out in us. Interestingly, if you look at some of the research globally around what happened in those COVID lockdown period, I think the most fascinating research was done by a team at the University of Chicago. And they looked at what happened to people's brains when they were socially cut off. We'd had this assumption for decades that healthy brains need lots of social connections, that we do well when we're connected to others. So loneliness, and we know about the loneliness epidemic, the impact that has on things like cardiovascular health and longevity and all the rest of it. But we'd never really studied what it does for the way we think until en masse, you had whole populations at home, isolated. What they found is that when you're lacking social connections, the amygdala, which is where that fight and flight reflex resides, part of the instinctive mind, shrinks, and this surface becomes coarser, becomes different, it changes. Now, the tricky thing with that is when the amygdala shrinks, those fight and flight reflexes become more acute. And is there any wonder, for instance, that when we were locked in our homes, scrolling through Instagram, people just went off the deep end. Like the number of people, and you'd know them, I'd know them, who went way down the rabbit hole of conspiracy belief and got really antagonistic toward others and bitey online and very tribal. This was an overflow of what we were going through, how the environment around us impacted on the way our brains function. Sleep does a very similar thing. So if you look at what happens while we sleep, the term in the world of neuroscience is synaptic pruning. Synaptic pruning is like, remember, for those who are old enough to remember defragging your computer, maybe you'd get your hard drive and you'd press defrag and you watch those little things go along and in row by row basically reorganize your hard drive and make it work more efficiently. Our brains do the same thing at night while we're asleep. If you're not getting enough sleep, you're literally not defragging mentally. And so that does affect how you process information and tends to cause you to be far more tribal, far more instinct-driven rather than actually taking the time to think and be reasonable. So these are all things that we certainly learned a lot of throughout the pandemic years.
Yeah, I think that approach of unfair, it's interesting, with parenting, you kind of, there's no rule book, right? But you do know that you're probably going to be lacking in sleep. So it's kind of one of those ones where you've you've agreed to the terms of, okay, I'm a parent now, this is going to happen.
Yep.
But when you're so used to, I mean, I'm so used to controlling everything, from since I was very little, because you make sure you get sleep. So I'll say no to social engagements or certain things, because you need to narrow that focus. And I think all high performers are very, very good at saying no. And people who are not so high performing are very good at saying yes. Like they say yes to everything. Whereas those that really know where they're going and what they want to achieve will just say no to those things.
Yes.
But coming back to COVID, right? COVID was an interesting one for me. I grew up on a farm in New Zealand. The nearest neighbor was a mile away.
Yep.
The school I went to from ages 5 to 12 or 5 to 13, for probably some of the older ones, had 28 kids when I first arrived, with, I think, 2 teachers. By the time I left with 1 year to go in primary school, there were only 7. And so I had, like, from a young age, I was able to keep myself entertained. I'm happy in silence. And being an endurance athlete, being a swimmer, golly, how many hours do you sit there swimming up and down the pool in your own head? Or
complete silence, yeah.
Or when I moved to Asia, I lived in Asia for 10 years. I lived in Taiwan for 7.5, where my friend network spoke Mandarin mainly with a little bit of English. I spoke nearly entirely English with a few words of Mandarin.
Yeah.
And I would go out training with them, and I'd love walking down the street, because there'd be all these conversations going on. You had no idea what happened. And I used to hate going back to New Zealand when on my breaks, because you would then you could then acutely hear every single detail of every person's conversation around you, and it used to drive me nuts. I'm like, I just want to go back to Asia where it's just white noise again. It's more fun. So when COVID hit, I was in my element. I literally, all these people were struggling on day one. I'm like, okay, well, I've run an online coaching business since 1998 in the world of sport. I had the largest online, endurance coaching business in Asia for a period there during the 2000s. And so I was like, this is a piece of cake. I know how it works. So literally on the day, I'm getting all these people going, I don't know what to do. I'm struggling. I'm like, okay, well, here's what you do. You do this, this, and this. So I had a very different experience of COVID, and we lived in Canberra at the time. So I think we didn't have a case for 400 days or something ridiculous, when New South Wales and Victoria around us, everything was happening. But here we were in Canberra, we could literally just live our own lives, and for most of it. And when we were, contained to our apartments, etc., as I said, I was kind of in my happy place. I knew what to do. Everything was normal for me in a way. And everyone's going, oh, this is not normal. It's weird. And I'm like, okay, look, it's okay. You'll get through it. Don't worry. I've done it many times before. So I had a very, very different experience. And then we had a company that we built, an online corporate training company that we just looked at it from a very different perspective. Didn't even research, did nothing on what other corporate training companies do or anything like that. Did no SWOT analysis, no competitive analysis, because I didn't want to know what they did. I didn't want to be biased. I wanted to have a blank slate, and our team loved that. And so we grew massively and had huge growth through COVID. So my experience is totally oblivious to what 99% of the rest of the world had.
How
and
interesting.
Sometimes conversations around COVID, I have to bite my tongue and just literally go, I can't share what I had.
Yep.
Because people go, oh, that's unfair. Like, how did you have that? I had this. And so they go into defensive mode, and the conversations I find are a little bit on edge. So I just tend to just keep it internal, just to kind of keep people feeling good.
Yeah.
In a way.
Which is, it's great, because I think what that shows is that you were able to adapt fast. And many of us did. It was just, we adapted in ways that weren't fun. Like I built a studio. I hate remote speaking, no interest at all in remote speaking. Like I remember in the whole COVID years, I had colleagues that are like, I'm loving this. I can't wait to keep doing this forever. I never want to get on a plane. I'm like, knock yourself out. Have fun with that. The moment borders open and conferences are happening, I'm out. I'm on the road. I love people. I love the variety, the adventure. Remote delivery to me is utterly and completely soul destroying, because there's no dance. There's no to and fro. There's no energy. There's nothing that happens. Like you click off at the end of a session, like, I don't know, I spoke to 3,000 people and I didn't see a soul. So now that's me. That's my temperament. So fortunately, I'm in a market that tends to favor that. So the speakers who were willing to get straight back out and do it, they bounce back fast. Those who are like, oh, no, I'm just going to sort of keep doing the remote thing, very quickly, now training is a bit different to conferences, but from a conference perspective, people like do not want to do remote conferences. Like I've got one on Friday this week. It'll be the first one I've done in 6 months, and that suits me fine. So, like, it's interesting how different people have responded and reacted. But for a lot of us, certainly in my world, we did the remote thing because you had to. Now, some didn't. Some just like literally just waited it out. Like, I'll wait till things open again. I'm like, well, you've got to adapt. Like, you've got to move with what's happening. You can ignore the reality, but this is reality. As much as it sucks, this is reality. So go with it. But of course, as soon as things open back up, I couldn't wait to get back out. And I think we all of us learned a lot about ourselves in those moments. What I learned is how extroverted I am. I actually thought I was genuinely quite introverted pre-COVID because like I spend a lot of time on my own, on the road. I'll go to a hotel room. I don't even think to turn the TV on. I'm super happy with silence. And like just, I do a lot of my best thinking in silence. I'm like, I guess that just means I'm introverted. And yet what I found is that during the pandemic, I didn't realize that extroversion isn't just about people contact. It's about variety of external experiences. So it's like changing environments, changing locations, changing inputs. So being in the same spot day after day, like did my head in, whereas I needed the variety and the adventure. So that's actually what extroversion is. It's getting energy from outside, be it through people or experiences. So yeah, that was interesting. I've certainly discovered that about myself during the pandemic. So yeah, I mean, everyone navigated it differently, but it was all about making the most with what was going on, the hand that you were dealt.
Mm. Okay, so imagine you're a leader right now. You're in an organization. It's the beginning of 2024. You're wanting to make change. There's a whole lot of stubborn people inside your organization. What is some easy, tangible takeaways for our listeners that they can be able to apply that will help them to be able to sort of bring those stubborn people in a bit closer and over time be able to influence and persuade them that the change can help them?
So it depends on a couple of variables. So whether you're doing this one to many. So if you're trying to speak to 30 of your leaders and persuade them as a group, and a group persuasion, it can be incredibly effective because there's that sense that we move as a pack, as humans. So that herd instinct can be very, very valuable. If you can steer the herd, even if only 70% of the group are online, the stats tell us that 100% will actually change because there's that sense that everyone else is doing it, so I should too. So if you're dealing with one-on-one, it's a bit different. And it also depends on the level of social capital you've got with the people that you're engaging with. So if they know you well, if there's high trust, then you can approach persuasion quite differently to if there's not high trust. So let's start with, if there's not high trust, the first thing is you've got to win affinity. You've got to be seen as trustworthy, someone who's got their best interests in mind. This is what Aristotle talked about as ethos, this notion of being credible and trustworthy in the eyes of the people you're trying to engage with. And so much of that is about self-deprecation. Don't take yourself too seriously. Self-disclosure is also effective. Don't just share all the good reasons why you think people should change. Share the fact that you've also got doubts. That you think this is right, but you're open to input. You're open to other people's perspectives. That changes the entire posture because now it's not about me pushing an idea on you. It's about me suggesting an idea. And so that can be as simple as prefacing anything you're saying to people with that, hey, this is just my sense, but well, I think that maybe, or take this for what it's worth, or I may be way off here, but, and like even beginning with sentences like that builds trust and affinity because you're enlisting people to contribute to the process, not be passive recipients of what you're trying to push to them. If you're dealing with people who are resistant because they don't want the change, the loss dynamic of like, what if I lose certainty or status? One of the keys then is to make change feel like an extension on the past. So this is something you're already doing. This is something you know how to do already. Or even, if you do need to do things that are new and fresh and a bit foreign, how do you use the language, the symbols, the iconography of the organization that feels familiar? Don't change everything. Try and keep things like the names of departments, the names of projects, even titles the same, because as much as you can make people feel like some things are changing, but not everything is changing, the more willing they'll be to go along with it. The other one is, if you want to get people on board, use narratives, use stories, because stories get to what the instinctive mind does well, which is pattern recognition and narrative formation. Put it in the context of a story of someone else who went through this change and what they found, as opposed to your logical reasons for why the change is necessary. And if the change you're asking people to make has to do with the benefit of someone else, try and make sure people feel that they know the individual they're connecting with. Be it, let's say, you're trying to get people to give to a charity or to change so that it's better going to serve the customer. And it may well cost them, but the customer is going to benefit from this. Have you heard the voice of the customer? Like, make sure you're letting people get a feel for a visceral sense of why what they're doing, why the change is going to actually help, and appeal to that sense of altruism that if you do this, it's going to help someone else. It's amazing how the instinctive mind is actually more wired toward altruism than self-interest. So tell the story of who's going to benefit, and tell that story and only one person's story. The research shows us if you try and tell the stories of 3, 4, 5, 10, a community of people, it doesn't work. Tell one story in vivid detail.
Yeah.
And so unlocking empathy is incredibly effective. And this is also really powerful when you're dealing with team dynamics where you might have two different factions or groups or tribes and there's animosity between them. What we found in the research, and it's really, I think, really important to have front of mind, is the best solution for prejudice is proximity. If you don't know the other side and don't know their story and don't have a connection with them, it's very easy to stand back from a distance on principle and disagree with someone and dislike someone, even have disgust for someone. But when you get to know them, a lot of that prejudice sort of starts to melt away. So there's just a couple of tips. And in the book, there's a whole host of the stuff, but that's just a few things front of mind that I would say are worthwhile leading with.
Yeah, I think it's really, really good. When we talk, really what we're talking about here is change management. Influence and persuading is change. And I think the key part that is missed most often is that ability to visualize what the change will look like, whether that is getting them to imagine something or, as you say, sharing a story of an individual that has gone through either something very, very similar or something that you can kind of relate to.
Correct.
Helps those human beings, but it's very rarely used and it's so, so powerful.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, we all know smart people have great answers, but the most successful people ask great questions.
Mm.
When was the last time you did something for the first time?
It's a great question. So probably a few weeks ago would be the example to that. So I went out with a couple of other friends and their kids. We went out to this cable ski park out in Western Sydney, and I'd never done that before. Very different to normal water skiing. If you've ever done a cable ski park, they have these wires that scoot around these big lakes, and when you get to a corner, it swaps from one channel to the next, and it just like throws you off if you're not ready for it. There's a real skill to doing that. But I'm at this cable ski park. I did kneeboarding. Never done kneeboarding before. And it was really interesting. So different to skiing or wakeboarding. So that was something for the first time. And it took a few goes. I filtered a lot of water through my sinuses trying to stay onto this thing. But like once I got it, I'm like, this is actually pretty fun. So yeah, that would be the last time I did something very new for the first time.
Brilliant. You look at future trends, you look a lot around human behavior, but I'm really curious to know, what is the one question that you would love to solve?
I think the big one would be what we're seeing happen right now around tribalism and polarization. Like, how do you get people to come back to the middle? And we're seeing this play out in so many areas right now where it used to be, let's say politically left versus right, progressive versus conservative, Labor, Liberal, Republican, Democrat. Now it's like not even that, it's just good and evil. Yeah. Or it's like we love you or we're disgusted by you. Like this, we're so tribalized now. And sadly, a lot of political leaders are fed into this by using fear. Fear is a brilliant technique for leading to tribalism. The idea that I'll protect you, we're the right ones, they're the wrong ones, they're the enemy. And it's such a lazy way to persuade. It's incredibly effective, but it's toxic for democracy. It's toxic for society. It's pulling communities, families apart. And like, I would love to, in fact, that's probably the next body of research is how do you try and get people not to completely swap to one side. I mean, it's very difficult to get someone who's a Republican to be a Democrat. It happens, but there's probably an unrealistic goal. How do you get people to at least edge closer so we can have a conversation? That's where, the most robust and healthy dialogues happen. That's where minds change, is in the middle. And so that's what I'd love to see change.
Great. Love that. What for you, what is an inspiring great leader, and who is a great example of this for you?
So many I could talk about, particularly from clients. And some of these are people that are not famous, not well known, but they're just people who are really good at leading teams because they lead with heart. There's a real genuine care for almost like the shepherd motif of caring for the people they're leading. Like you really do see that play out so often. And I see that in many of my clients where you've just got a leader who just models that beautifully. But in terms of, I guess, a noteworthy leader who, I often get asked this question of who would you love to have dinner with? Who would you love to spend a few hours with? And that's always an interesting way to think about who would you really like to just chew the fat with and get a sense of what makes them tick. And someone who, like, as a leader that I really respect, and it's someone that I read a book by last year, and I just found it so insightful. It's a guy named Andy Stanley. So Andy Stanley is a leadership expert. Written a whole pile of books, but his main day job is actually running a church. He's a church pastor. And what I like about him, I'd just love to get inside his head and see what makes him tick, because the book I read of his last year was called Not In It to Win It. And it was basically, as someone who's pastoring a church in the deep South in Georgia in the US, where they're incredibly polarized, he has deliberately chosen not to choose a side, not to feed into that whole polarized debate. And he's somehow managed to navigate that well by keeping a diverse group together and in harmony and relationship. And one of the things in his book that just resonated so deeply with me is he said that in any relationship, when one person wins, a relationship always loses. And so how do we approach discussions and arguments and even this issue of division with the relationship as the key priority, as opposed to trying to win or make a point? So I think as a leader, I have such respect for the way Andy Stanley has approached so many of these very fractious issues in a very difficult time. And I'd just be so interested to see what makes him tick.
I love that answer. Michael, great conversation. How can people learn more about what you do, and what is the best way for people to connect with you?
Probably the best place to start would be my website. So everything sort of basically lives there. So michaelmcqueen.net is the website. We've also got a subdomain for the book, the new book specifically. That's mindstuck.net. It's a whole lot of resources and things on there. In terms of socials, I'm across all of them. I'm even on TikTok. I have no idea what I'm really doing there, but I'm on there and there's stuff happening there. But my main one is LinkedIn. So I share content at least once or twice daily on LinkedIn, videos, articles, stuff I'm reading that I think is really relevant and valuable. A lot of the trend-focused stuff. Every morning at 8:45 a.m. Sydney time, I'll do a daily update of whatever I've seen come through overnight. So any new announcements, technology, new data that's come to light. So probably LinkedIn will be the main place to connect. That'd be the most valuable spot.
Great. Fantastic. We'll share those links in the show notes. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. I've got to know you on a lot deeper level than I have before. We've had some interactions. I love that you continually evolve as a high-performing individual in the world of speaking, but not just speaking, but in the ability to look at thought leadership from a human perspective, the future trends, and always stay on top of it. It's quite easy to get comfortable with something that is doing really well, stick with it and go, hey, this is always going to work. And we know it doesn't. So your evolution is fascinating for me to see how that works. I love the whole concept around Mindstuck and really trying to get people to be a little bit less stubborn, and how do we influence them by thinking a little bit differently? And sometimes we get so caught up in this is what we've always known, this is how we approach it, when we need to be that curious and go, okay, what's a different lens we can look at this through? How can we bring people along the journey more effectively rather than just trying to throw them data and content?
Yep.
So thank you for sharing your insights, some of them personal as well, or especially around COVID and how you deal with that. And then also how you manage to stay on top of the game and be at the cutting edge in regards to being on stage day in, day out, week in, week out, year after year for your 20th year. And by the way, congratulations on 20 years. Look forward to seeing another 20 years from you if you've still got what it takes to keep going. It'd be awesome. But thank you so much for your time today. It's been really enjoyable.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. Cheers.
It's time for you to join the Inspiring Great Leaders movement by visiting craigjohns.com.au. Share this podcast on LinkedIn and be sure to hashtag Inspiring Great Leaders. We would love it if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Drop us a line with your feedback and questions and connect with us on the Craig Johns LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram pages. Be sure to check out the next Inspiring Great Leaders podcast, where the ordinary don't belong.